Hello and welcome to DVD 1. On this DVD I'll be looking at how to play the modern Italian game. That's 1e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6 and now bishop c4. A move that is as old as the hills, rapid development, eyeing f7 being the order of the day. But White's idea is much more subtle than just a naked attempt to down black with a quick attack on his weakest point at the start. In volume 1 then we're going to be looking at the classical Italian game, which starts with the move bishop c5. I'll also be considering the Hungarian defence, which is a solid but passive way to play for black as well. In volume 2 of the series I'll be looking at the two knights defence. And well, of course, this is a much more complicated and aggressive way to play with black. There I'm recommending the interesting, to say the least, move knight g5. The two DVDs will hopefully provide something of a contrast for you in terms of a repertoire, because against the modern Italian game, going back to this particular volume, first of all White plays c3, which seems to faint at playing d4. Black generally counters with knight f6, and now the characteristic move d3, which has become very popular in modern times. This might look like a very quiet move, but actually White's position packs a surprisingly big punch if black even goes slightly wrong. Many grandmasters have used d3 with success. It has appeared in numerous World Championship matches. This move was out of fashion for a long time. In fact, the whole modern Italian game more or less died a death back in the early part of the 20th century, because it was felt that black just simply had too much freedom in this position, too much choice of what to do. But then many strong grandmasters started to re-evaluate White's chances, and of course the Ruy Lopez was one of the main reasons for the lack of popularity of this opening. And certain positions from the modern Italian game are very similar to the Ruy Lopez, where White just plays in a more restrained fashion with d3 rather than play d4 straight away. Going back one move, we'll also be taking a look at queen e7, which again I would put in the category of solid but passive moves, although it is played from time to time. It was a favourite with Alexander Alekhine a long time ago, but hasn't been seen much since then. And we'll look at the passive d6. In general, against passive moves, White should change his plan and try to play with d4 as quickly as possible. That's what the move c3 is all about after all. It's just that in the modern Italian game, sometimes White defers this move to a more propitious moment. He doesn't play it straight away. So that's the intro. It's time to look at some games, and I think you'll find yourself picking up this system very quickly as we go through the games. Okay, well now it's time to go straight into the games. My first game comes from the World Under-16 Olympiad, which was played in Turkey in November 2010. It's from the Russia-Turkey match, and is an absolutely classic example of what White is trying to achieve when he uses the modern version of the Italian game. It's between Yuri Eliseyev and Igor Koksal. Okay, well White kicked off with e4, black played e5, and now White played bishop c4. This is obviously the bishop's opening, but it can quickly get back into our featured line if black plays knight c6, let's say. White goes knight f3 and black plays bishop c5, reaching the classic position for the Gioco Piano. Now my recommended move order is to continue with the normal move, which is c3. This leaves black wondering whether White's going to play d4 or not in one turn. In order to challenge that, black normally plays knight f6. He sets up counter pressure against the pawn on e4. And now I recommend the move d3. I think this is the best way to get into the Italian game, the best way to get the type of position we want, and restricts black's options. Black castled in this game, White castled too, and now black plays d6. Bishop b3. Alright, well this is a move order I'm sure you will have to get used to if you play the Italian game in this guise, and it's worthwhile now just detailing what White is trying to do. In essence, this is a kind of Ruy Lopez position, albeit in a very unusual guise. quite often in the Ruy Lopez you wouldn't necessarily see black's bishop on c5 at this stage. And whenever the bishop stays on c5, black's always got to wonder, is white threatening d4 or not? So basically your first idea is to look out for the right moment to play d4. I mean, you may not play it at all, but there will be some instances, for instance if black attacks f2 with a knight, or if he gets particularly free play with his pieces, that you may need to play d4 to restrict that bishop. So d4 is on the cards and probably will come with gain of time. Another move to watch out for in this position is bishop to g5. In the closed Ruy Lopez, with the black bishop on e7, this move doesn't have a great deal of impact. But in this particular position, I think you can see that that pin could be rather awkward for black. So definitely you should be watching out for this move as well. Finally, I think white's overall plan in this position is to obtain a nagging edge and to turn that edge into ultimately a kingside attack, rather in a similar way to the closed Ruy Lopez. So for instance, white can be considering moves such as h3, rook to e1, and then the traditional transfer of the knight on b1 in Ruy Lopez fashion towards the kingside. For instance, knight d2, knight f1. And when the knight's on f1, white can then choose between going to g3 or coming to e3, dependent on circumstances. Ultimately, the knight's destination would really like to be f5 or d5. I think the knight on f5 or d5 could well put severe pressure on black's position if it was played at the right moment. And hopefully, after the knight manoeuvre, white can translate this strength on the king side into a direct attack. Well, okay, those are his plans, I would say, in this position. Black played a6. Now this was a move which Korchnoi made very popular in a couple of games he played against Karpov in the World Championship match. I think it was back in 1981, if I'm not mistaken. And the idea of this move is simply to drop the bishop out of the centre, away from the advanced d4. It's a kind of prophylaxis. So, as you saw on the last move, white played knight bd2. And now white's looking to organise his play in a different way. He's not looking to play d4 anymore, I would say, for a while. Instead, I think the traditional plan of manoeuvring in Ruy Lopez fashion comes very much to the fore. And this is what Eliseev does here. h3 cuts down on black's activity. Knight e7 was played, and now white went through with the main idea. Rook e1, knight comes to g6, and now white brings his knight back to f1. Now, in the open game, you could say that black never really achieves a free position unless he can get the move d5 in. Now, I'm not sure that's so true here when his bishop's outside the pawn chain. If that bishop was locked in on e7, or in fact hadn't moved on f8, then yes, perhaps d5 would be the prescription. But the thing about this position is black lacks significant counterplay, whereas white's idea is very clear. I mean, white's probably going to play, I would say, knight g3 and then put the knight on f5 and then wait for black to actually do something. White may also play d4 in this position. It seems to me white has the greater choice of plans here, and this is a very common theme in the modern Italian game, the system that we are adopting. We're restricting black's play. We're building up this edge in space, in manoeuvring possibility, and then we're going to turn that into a direct attack, hopefully. Coxau becomes a little bit impatient here and plays his knight to h5. He thinks at one stroke he's stopped really the impact of bishop g5. I mean, bishop g5 could well have been a move. And he's planning to occupy f4. The knight will come into f4, the queen will come out to f6. Maybe black will even sacrifice a piece on h3. So by these means, black is hoping to work up a big attack himself. Now white plays a very characteristic move, d4. If black is playing on the edge of the board, white reacts in the centre and creates counter pressure on the pawn at e5. Well, this doesn't seem to stop Coxall in any way, shape or form. He just puts the knight on f4. He thinks e5 is protected. Queen f6 comes next, and there might be a sack on h3 coming up. White plays knight g3. Of course, white still has fairly substantial edge here because he's got the centre, and these central pawns are very restricting from black's perspective. Added to which, white has actually set a remarkably cunning trap which black falls straight in for when he plays queen f6. Now, well, from my perspective, that is the natural move in this position. But white uncorks a really stunning move here, knight to h5, and immediately black is put on the back foot. The point of this move is clear. If black takes that knight, white is going bishop g5, and that's the end of black's queen. That is quite a nice trap. You know, I could just see myself falling for that trap, funnily enough, because it's quite unusual. You wouldn't believe a board which is full of pieces that suddenly the queen could be so restricted, but it turns out that it is. So black has to beat the retreat here, and he goes back with queen e7. But now white does work up a big edge simply by taking twice on f4. Now he really is in charge of the centre, and queen d2 emphasises this advantage. The pawn at f4 is very, very weak. If black plays queen f6 in this position, he runs straight into e5. Basically, white is really getting to grips with the position before black gets mobilised. Now that pawn on f4 starts to look very, very weak. So Coxall's remedy is, well, desperate in a way, but perhaps he couldn't see how else to protect that pawn. He's hoping that white can't get at his ragged kingside now, but white breaks through very nicely with the move e5. And please note, this bishop on a7 is locked out of the game by the pawn at d4. This is a very thematic idea. Well, black tries to shut up shop there on the king side, and now white turns his attention to the light squares with queen to d3. Black plays king to g7, intending to answer bishop c2 with, I think, rook h8. And then maybe black's hoping to hang on. But white finds a better plan. Going back to the game, he plays rook e2. His idea is to concentrate fire in the e-file. So quite naturally, black tries to shut the e-file. I mean, if he kept the e-file open, I guess white would just penetrate to e7. There is another plus point to c6. Of course, it lets the bishop out. The bishop can now come back to b8. But the trouble is, black's queen side is very underdeveloped in this position. I guess that's one of the basic problems that black has to solve in the open game in general. You know, if you lag with queenside development in the open game, you can often come into a position like this where every single white piece is participating in the attack, but you know, black has three pieces out of the game. What is his rook doing on a8, or either of his bishops for that matter? So black is in real serious trouble. Rook h8 is the prescribed antidote to queen h7 check, but now white fashions a classic breakthrough. I mean, this was coming, and I don't think black could stop it. Devastating move. It's a decoy. This pawn is being decoyed away from g6, so white can land a serious check on that square. Well, black forces white to sacrifice the exchange to achieve this check, but the check comes nevertheless, and black can't defend this position. No way. White is attacking him with a queen, a rook and a knight. Black's only defending with the queen. Both of black's rooks and bishop on a7 are completely helpless to stop this attack. So the game really ends very swiftly now. Queen f5 check, king g8 and now rook g6. Completes a very well played game by Eliseev. That is a good place to start our investigation. It's quite an inspiring win for white and quite thematic too. A number of key ideas were presented there, ideas which will crop up a lot. Actually, you know, I find this opening very, very suitable for club players. Simply because black has no clear route to equality. It's not as if the theory of this opening is particularly well developed. It's almost as if both players from an early stage in the game are just playing, you know, with ideas and off the top of their head. Because, you know, this is not the type of opening which lends itself to long theoretical variations. It's more a quiet game at the outset, where both players just try to get their pieces out. And it seems to me that White's choice of plans is slightly greater. His position has more potential here than Black's does. Although, of course, Black has won his fair share of games from this situation. Nevertheless, draw your own conclusions from the following game, which comes from the Lithuanian Championship, which was played in April 2010 between Julius Garnelius and Viktoras Galushchak. It's the same type of game as last time, except that Black makes a minor imprecision in the opening. Almost imperceptible. You may not even notice it as we go through the opening moves. But White makes him pay for this imprecision. And this will be, therefore, another very instructive game. Well, as we saw in the last game, Black steps away out of the centre to dissuade White from playing d4. Probably Black's going to follow this move up with something like bishop g4. However, I think if we just go back, Black would probably have done better just to play a6 and retreated the bishop all the way to a7. We'll see why in a minute. Probably Black doesn't sense the danger at this moment in time. That's my perception of events. So Garnelius just builds up slowly. He makes room for the knight on b1 to come across to f1. And now Black goes through with the same idea we saw in the last game. He manoeuvres the knight to g6 in the hope that, he may start a kingside attack. However, it's here that White takes advantage of Black's move order by playing the excellent move knight c4. I think White's only going to actually nab one of Black's bishops in this position. That's the problem for Black. It might not seem like too much of a gain. I mean, the positional threat, I would suppose, is a4. That's White's main threat when he puts the knight on c4. That threatens to win the bishop outright, I think, or at least cause the bishop severe embarrassment. And if Black plays a6 or a5, White would simply take that bishop off on b6. White would then have the two bishops and this nagging edge that we are looking for. Well, in the game, Galushchak chooses a rather simplistic way of playing the position, but I think already White is better because of this move knight c4 and because of the inability of Black to preserve his bishop pair. So bishop e6, White played the excellent move d4, pressure on in the centre. Black took on c4, White recaptured, Black took on d4, White captured with the knight, and now Black thought he was freeing his game by playing d5. But in reality, all Black is doing is actually opening up the game for White's two bishops. So from a small edge, now White's advantage starts to grow, and grow significantly. Basically, Black has no opponent to White's light square bishop. Jeremy Silman, in one of his more famous books, I think How to Reassess Your Chess perhaps, talked of imbalances in a position. You look for imbalances and then you try to work with them. One imbalance that I see in this position is that White has a light square bishop which can't be opposed, and Black has a knight in the centre. Which of these two pieces has the better potential? Well, of course, it has to be the bishop on c4. So White, quite correctly in this game, tries to emphasise the power of this bishop by playing queen f3. And Black must keep the knight in the centre. If he retreats the knight, it'll just be worse. Let's just verify that. If he goes knight f6, I mean, you're already running into moves like bishop g5. And if bishop takes d4, I'm not even sure that White can't go rook a d1 in this position. Bishop takes f2 check and just take it. Black could be in a terrible mess very quickly in this position because of his lack of development of the rooks. White is operating with two extra rooks in play, and he's going to get his pawn back. And he's driving the Black queen a horrible square. So Black, I think, going back to the game, correctly keeps his knight in the centre, but the pressure now really starts to build as White plays his knight into the very thematic square f5. In general, in this opening, if you can manoeuvre a knight into f5, then the chances are you're really starting to put the heat on Black's king. And it's one of the overall aims of this opening, I would say. Knight from b1 to d2 to f1 to either g3 or e3 and then into f5. I mean, here White has even found a way for the f3 knight to come into f5. This is paradise for White, I would say. Black seizes the only chance he's got really to exchange off the knight. I mean, if he leaves the knight on the board, it's just going to kill him. So quite correctly, I think, black exchanges off the knight, and now of course black's attacking the bishop on c4 along the 4th rank, but white just grabs the knight on d5. Pawn takes, and now g3, coolly defending himself. Black's got this big juicy weakness on d5 and no way to get rid of it. Now, in positions where a player has an isolated queen's pawn, the general rules are as follows. The person with the isolated queen's pawn understands that this is a game-long weakness. So he's either got to be very active to compensate for the pawn weakness. In other words, he's got to keep his pieces on aggressive squares to prevent white from just simply taking the pawn, or he's got to try and get rid of the weakness. Now here, black can definitely think about playing d4 at the right moment to get rid of this weakness. Or can he? Because white now plays another excellent move, bishop e3. I think however way you look at it, black is going to end up a pawn down in this position. When the d pawn advances, b7 becomes weak. Black has no way to relieve the pressure. So Goluschek probably thought to himself, okay, let's try and take a few pieces off, bail out into an endgame. Major piece endgame, you know, if I can keep active I might hold the draw. Well, no such luck as white trains his sights on the poor d pawn. I mean, black tries his best. He puts his rook on e4. That blocks the queen out of the game for a little while. But white's position is so rock solid. You know, it's characteristic of this variation. Black keeps an eye on the pawn on d5. White just doubles up. White's position is as safe as the Bank of England. You know, there's no way in for black. Ultimately, black is just going to lose this pawn. And that will be that. You know, a pawn down. If your technique's not good enough, so be it. But almost imperceptibly, black has drifted into a lost position. And that's the way it can happen in this particular opening. So Goluschek just tries to play some natural moves. White does a bit of gardening at the back. He plays king g2. And now black tries to liquidate by playing d4. Obviously, if black had played rook to e5 in this position, white just takes on d5 with a clear pawn up in the endgame. I mean, this should be an easy win. Well, perhaps not an easy win, but it should be a win. You settle for a pawn up at the start, wouldn't you? So going back to the game, black plays d4. Okay, that's another pawn down the drain. Takes, takes. And now you see the move black wants to make is something like rook e2 or queen e2. But he can't because of his back rank problems. So he plays g6 to give his king a bit of air. White plays c4 and black had enough. He actually resigned this position. This showed quite a bit of respect for the opponent. Okay, the guy with white was several hundred elo points higher rated than his black opponent. Maybe you wouldn't resign this position, but it's really bad. I think white is just going to penetrate to the 7th rank with his rook. If black doesn't play a move like queen c6, well, I mean, after queen c6, I suppose the simplest way is just to take it and go rook d7. This should be a fairly easy win. As far as I can see, I think white is winning another pawn in this position. So that was that. Another effortless win for white. And black really didn't seem to do too much wrong in that game, yet lost in 28 moves. Well, I wouldn't normally include a simultaneous display game on one of my DVDs, but when the player with white is Garry Kasparov, I think I'm entitled to make a few exceptions. And in fact, this next game, a game Kasparov played in Lisbon in 1999 against a Portuguese player called Tiago Pinheiro, is incredibly instructive. In fact, I think this is by far the best way to present this opening in terms of just instructive games showing you the main ideas. You don't need to know an enormous amount of theory to play the modern Italian game. What you need to know are the ideas that underpin the opening. And in this game, well, Kasparov virtually runs through the whole lot in one game. So let's see this excellent demolition job by Kasparov. And we're lucky because it features our precise move order that we want to adopt. Bringing the bishop out to c4. Black plays bishop c5. We play c3, which seems to lead up to d4. And in fact, that would be the main line of the Gioco Piano. But instead of d4, which is an okay move, but it's a little bit too aggressive, a little bit too soon, we're going to play the restrained d3. Pinheiro castled, Kasparov castled, and now black plays d6. So this is the first moment when black has protected the pawn on e5 that white has to be a little bit alert to the future of this bishop. We don't want black to play knight a5 and take off this bishop, or even to gain any time at all. If we play bishop b5, he plays c6 and so on. So this is a good moment just to play the prophylactic move bishop to b3. This enables us to preserve our bishop whatever happens, and the bishop is less exposed on b3 than it is on c4. Probably the bishop will drop back to c2 as and when, in a similar style to the Ruy Lopez. Then white will be looking to play d4, and the bishop eventually comes back into the game. So Pinheiro played bishop to g4, and that's a move which I would classify as pseudo-active. It looks active. It looks like a good, strong, healthy, developing move. But I'm not so sure it's actually a good move at all. I think that bishop is exposed on g4. However, it's a move a lot of club players would play. It lacks strength because black can't follow it up with knight d4. Black has no real threat to come into d4. So, you know, the pin on the knight, so what, says Kasparov? I'll just play h3. I wanted to play that anyway. If you feel free to take the knight on f3, then I've got two bishops. Well, Pinheiro retreated with bishop h5. Now Kasparov started to bring his knight across. Black played queen d7, and now very calmly white played rook e1. Now black's starting to run out of ideas already. He's developed all of his minor pieces to reasonable looking squares. The queen's come up. Now what to do with the rooks? Well, we know the rule of the rooks. The rook goes to an open file or stays behind a pawn, wants to get pushed. Look at the black rooks. Black is in no position to get those rooks into the game. White's rook, what does that do? Well, if we consider that white wants to play d4 in a moment, then, you know, that rook could easily come into the game very quickly. Anyway, black just tries to play as solid a move as he can, rook f8, and Kasparov goes through with the manoeuvre, bringing the knight to g3, which of course this time comes with gain of time because black's obligingly put his bishop out on h5. He doesn't want to see this bishop just yet, and now Kasparov plays knight h4. This is almost an echo of the first game we looked at, where black was trying to do the same to white. Here, I think the fact that black's moved his queen and the knight on h4 isn't attacked, or even attacked in an indirect way, makes white's position really excellent. Kasparov follows up with queen to f3, and he's getting ready to entrench a knight on f5. Either one of these knights is coming into f5, and that signifies immediate and very uncomfortable pressure for Pinheiro. So very thematic manoeuvres by Garry Kasparov. Now it's very hard to offer good advice to black in this position. I think white's already completely bossing the game, and it really is hard to suggest move. If, for instance, the guy goes queen f8, well, already white can start thinking in terms of playing h4 and just coming on with h5. This will probably oblige black to give up the bishop for the knight on f5 straight away. So Pinheiro thinks, okay, well, I really don't like my position, I'll just have to take it and take the medicine. So he takes the knight off. Hopefully just exchanging that piece will decrease the power of white's attack. Knight takes f5, queen f8, and now Kasparov just builds up nicely. I mean, he's in full charge of the position. Again, he's got a dominant light squared bishop which can't be opposed. Rook a d8, rook a d1. There's no need to rush this position just yet. c6, bishop c1, bishop b6, and now we come to another classic moment in the game where white seizes the moment and plays d4, completely dominating the centre, and black is struggling to find a response which is adequate because he doesn't have any counterplay. Black took, white recaptured, black played d5, white pushed on with e5, knight d7. Well, another one of these very pseudo-active moves was knight e4 in this position. I don't like that move because I don't see a good retreat square for the knight. For instance, what if white plays just quietly with bishop to c2? I think already black is in a hopeless mess. I mean, if he plays knight to g5, we can just play queen g4. And black is in a terrible spot here. So he has to go backwards. Now white builds up. You can do these things when your opponent doesn't have any move. I find this makes chess much easier. Black's position is so passive that he can't do anything. And again, you wouldn't say that he made many mistakes in this game, would you? A lot of his difficulties stem from his inability to understand that bishop g4 wasn't really a very good move. But a lot of your opponents are going to play exactly in that way. He had to cede the bishop pair. Now he's got to sit and watch as Kasparov completely obliterates his king. Bishop c2. Well, black is certainly worried about the thought of the white queen coming across to the long diagonal and then ouch, some sort of mate on h7. You can just see this coming. Bishop a5 was answered by rook e2. There's absolutely no need for white to rush this because black can't do anything. f6, trying desperately to get a bit of room and counterplay. Knight h4, threatening the crushing knight g6. King g8, and Kasparov plays queen f5. There's no need to put the knight on g6, that would just block the queen's path down to the beautiful square on h7. Queen f7, hoping to put a knight on f8. No such luck. In comes the queen. In comes the knight. Game over. There was even one more move played, although I'm not quite sure why it was played, unless Kasparov looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The heart attack did not materialise. Bishop takes g6. 1-0. Okay, very excellent game by Kasparov. It would be easy to just poo-poo that game as extremely one-sided, grandmaster versus amateur, blah blah blah. But I think that teaches us a lot about how to play this opening, and certainly about, you know, pseudo-active moves like bishop g4. It's so easy to make them with black. You know, they can be regretted for a long time. Well, so far most of the games we've been looking at have been one-sided. White just taking advantage of mistakes and putting black away in almost effortless fashion. Now we come to an all grandmaster clash, which was played in fact in the USSR Championship in Frunze back in 1981. It's an old game, but again remarkably instructive for its content. Playing white is Alexander Belyavsky, and playing black is Boris Gulko. Household names, two of the strongest grandmasters in the world at that time. So Belyavsky kicked off with e4, and we quickly reach our desired position. Bishop c4. Okay, black played the two knights variation with knight f6. White played d3. That's not my recommended move on the companion DVD. I'm recommending knight g5 in this position for white, because I think it shows a clear contrast, you know, and gives some spice to the repertoire. You've got the quiet waters of the Italian game, and you've got the turbulent waters of the knight g5 line. But if you want to play d3, you could always play it. But of course black has more choice here than he does in the normal Italian game, because he hasn't committed his bishop to c5 yet. However, this is precisely what Gulko does. He does play bishop c5, and so we conveniently come back to our desired position after c3. And now Gulko voluntarily retreats this bishop out of the centre. Well, rook e1. Interesting move. I mean, following the thread of what we've been looking at so far, I wonder whether white could have considered bishop b3. There's also another move in this position, bishop g5. This can often be a very dangerous idea when the black bishop can't come back to e7 to relieve the pin. So either of those moves could have been played here. And it's interesting to see that Belyavsky prefers to play rook e1. And I think the reason he's played rook e1 is that black hasn't yet committed his d-pawn. I wonder whether white's thinking, now can black play d5 in one go? Certainly this is quite an important point to take on board. When the black player hasn't moved his d-pawn, watch out for that sudden move d5. Usually that move in this variation leaves the pawn on e5 rather exposed. Let me take away these colours. Yeah, usually that advance will leave the pawn on e5 exposed. So maybe that's why white puts his rook on e1, and why Gulko in turn plays just d6 and goes back into a normal position after knight bd2. Again, I have to say I slightly prefer bishop b3 in this position, because after knight bd2 I'm wondering whether black can play bishop e6 and force off the light squared bishops. That might not be such a bad deal for black, all things being equal, and if white decides to chop this bishop off, then black gets the open f-file for his rook. And, well, black can start to think about moves like knight h5. So, anyway, knight bd2 was played. Probably after bishop e6, Beliavsky would have played some move like b4 and just gained a little bit of space on the queen side. And if bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, that's quite a nice square for the knight. White will have a very small edge in the position that arises. Probably white's just threatening a4 in this position, something like that. White's just a little bit better. And with this opening, you know, you should be satisfied with that. It's a type of little bit better, which is easy to increase. Your advantage can expand. Whereas for black, it's not so easy to play these positions, I can promise you. Going back to the game then, Gulko, I think, was playing for the win. I mean, that's pretty clear. He's playing ambitiously, as others have done before him, as we've seen already on the DVD. Black manoeuvres his knight to g6 with hope of starting some action on the king side, and white is doing exactly the same thing. The knight comes across to g3 and eyeing f5, obviously. Now Gulko does play bishop e6, and when you leave your bishop out on c4, that's something you've always got to be aware of, that white's bishop may be challenged. And now what is white going to play here? Well, Beliavsky decided just to retreat. Now if black takes, white can choose. He can take with the pawn, which is not so bad, or he can take with the queen, which is also probably good enough for a slight edge. Maybe white was going bishop g5 there. The move h6 is not really a move black wants to make here, because it could lead to some sacrifice on h6 at some point. Black doesn't see this coming up in the very near future, but black's got to be aware that pawn on h6 could become a clear target of white attack. But with only a small edge to work with, Beliavsky just decides to restrict black's chances by playing h3 and then taking the centre with d4. Now, it's a paradox of this variation that d4 is better delayed than executed right away. I mean, white could have executed d4 in the main line of Gyoko Piano back on move 5 if black had played bishop c5, c3, our normal move order. Here, d4, because it's delayed, gains in a bit of strength, because the black pieces in the centre are a little bit exposed. And yeah, I think white keeps a slight edge by these means. He's got more space and more ability to manoeuvre. Nevertheless, black's position is not that bad. He plays c6, white goes bishop c2, queen c7. That move bishop c2 was actually quite logical, because with more space you keep the pieces on. That's exactly what Beliavsky is trying to do. And after rook a d8, he just gets his queen off the d-file by playing queen e2. Well, now, certainly the move black should be trying to play is d5. We'll see that he plays this in the game, but perhaps at the wrong moment. Now, this move possibly requires a little bit of preparation, as we'll see. Gulko in the game decided to play knight f4, which looks intimidating, but in reality, after queen d2, it doesn't actually do anything. All that it does is encourage white to think about sacrifices on h6, because no way is black going to play g5 in this position. And if he retreats his knight, that's a clear loss of time. A sacrifice on h3 is ludicrous. So I think knight f4 was a mistake. Possibly Gulko wanted to drag the white queen back to the d-file. You know, he retreats his knight, kind of like an offer of a draw. White goes queen e2 and the two players shake hands. Going back to the position after queen e2 then, I wonder whether bishop c8 was a better move. Looks a bit weird that, but black is getting ready for d5. He's hoping that this freeing move is going to solve his problems. It might well do in this position. It might not. As I say, I think white's only got a slight edge here, but it is something. More space in the centre, and the black pieces are a little bit cramped. Well, knight f4 was played, probably an error. Queen d2, and now the knight went back to g6. Beliavsky's not interested in the draw. He knows he's better in this position, and I think he's probably calculated that black's next move, d5, is weak. Now, clearly that takes some calculation, because this is quite a difficult position optically at first sight. You know, you look at it and you're a bit dazzled by all these pawn captures in the centre. But Beliavsky, top grandmaster, has calculated this very nicely, and sees a clear way to actually proceed. He plays knight takes e5. Then he plays bishop f4, pinning the knight. Very nice indeed. Knight fd7. Of course, what's noticeable here is the inability of the dark square bishop to come to the help of that pinned knight. Now he opens up fire on the knight once more, compelling black to take with the bishop. Now he takes the knight. Knight takes e5, and now the move I think white calculated well in advance. The beautiful rook takes e5. Rook takes e5. What else? c4. Black is in trouble. I think black may well be lost. Black is the exchange up only for an instant. If he plays bishop takes c4 in this position, white reveals his point. He just takes off the rook on d8 twice, and then bishop takes e5, nabs a piece. So going back to c4, I'm not sure how black extricates himself from the double pin. You know, he's pinned on e5, he's pinned on d5. He tried queen e7. Bishop takes e5, nice and easy. Easy does it. And now Gulko struck out with what he thought was a tactical idea. However, now comes another nice stroke from Beliavsky. Queen takes d8 check. And this move takes advantage of the fact that black's back rank is weak. The escape square is covered by the bishop on c2, so that when black recaptures on d8 as he must, white just takes back on f3. And white miraculously ends up with rook, bishop and knight for the queen, which is plenty in a situation like this, because all these pieces can combine to put the boot in on poor black's king, as we're about to see. Well, white anchors the bishop. Black was going to take it for sure. Queen comes out to c5. Bishop comes to d4, covering f2. Of course, white had to let the c pawn go, but he gets a beautiful diagonal for the bishop. Queen b4, trying to keep white on the hop, but now comes another decisive move. Bishop takes b6. A takes b6. Rook d7. Now, actually, it was tempting here to play rook d8 check, and then bishop takes f7. But I think there, black hopefully can recuperate, or hopefully from his perspective, with queen takes f4. And black has got some counterplay in this position, because he might be going, if white doesn't mate him, he might be going just queen c1 and then queen takes b2. The knight on g3 is a little bit out of the game. Fortunately for Beliavsky, he hasn't mucked this up. He finds a much more accurate move in the game. Rook d7. And the point of this is when black takes on f4, in comes the bishop. Check. King h7. And now this beautiful move. Bishop g6 check to finish matters. That's a very nice finishing stroke. And in fact, Gulko had nothing other than to resign this position. So let's just see why he resigns. Obviously, if he retreats with the king, then rook d8 check wins immediately. Forces black to put the queen in the way and he's two pieces down. Then comes king takes g6. Well, we have an equally nice tactic against that. Rook takes g7 check. King takes g7. And now knight h5 check, winning the queen. So, one of those games where white got his typical small edge out of the opening and black just cracked under the pressure. He tried to become active at the wrong moment, and we're talking about a world-class grandmaster here, and paid the full price. White's position throughout was well balanced. Not 100% sure he played the opening, totally correctly. So it all turned out very well in the end. And Beliavsky calculated a lot in the middle of that game. He showed how it was possible very clearly to deal with that move d5, the thematic breakout attempt. One of the nice things about researching this DVD is that there are plenty of modern games featuring this variation. I mean, it crops up all the time in tournaments of any class all over the world. And they're mostly very instructive games as well. I mean, this next game comes from an open tournament played in Italy in August 2010. It's between two very strong Italian players, Daniele Vocaturo, who's graded 2526, and Rafael Di Paolo, who's graded 2350. But yeah, just a very good game all the way through by white. Now, black plays quite logically in the opening of this game, as far as I can see. It's a traditional bishop's opening to start off with, but this opening has transpositional qualities. Both sides have to play ball, if you like, to get back into the desired variation, but get back we do. And I think Vocaturo plays what I believe to be the most accurate move order. He plays c3 first, then he plays bishop b3. Okay, and now black plays a6 and goes through with the cautionary idea of creating a square for his bishop on a7, so the bishop doesn't get hassled. Now comes h3, another typical move in this system. We've already seen that bishop g4 is not really much of a threat, so why does white play h3? Well, I think later on the move g4 can be very handy for white to assist in the kingside attack. I'm not saying white will play g4, but having that option on the table is a really good idea. Now, I suppose the same argument applies to white as black. I mean, I was talking about the move h6 by black being a target for white's attack. The move h3 could also be a target for a black attack. I do understand that. But in order to sacrifice on h3 successfully, black's probably got to put a knight on f4, then his queen's got to come out to f6. I just don't see black doing that in the very near future. So white just makes his position slightly better. He doesn't make it worse, and he takes away a few black options when he plays h3. He also gives himself additional possibilities. So a good move all round. I suppose black, after a move like that, should be looking to play in the centre, and that's exactly what black does by playing bishop e6. And this move, let's face it, it looks sensible. Black is getting ready to exchange off the powerful light squared bishop. So knight bd2. Okay, well, let's just see. If bishop c2, retaining the pieces, I suppose black could be thinking about playing d5 in this position. I'm not sure whether that move is playable or not. I think it is. If it's not, okay, black's game is still pretty okay, and let's see if we can come out with a decent plan. Well, one decent plan is possibly h6. Another decent plan could be to put the king in the corner. Let's go back, yep, king into the corner. And the idea of that is to play knight g8 and f5. Perhaps black can go active by these means. So in the game, white sees no reason to refuse the exchange of bishops. He plays knight bd2 and black plays queen d7. Knight f1 by white. Bishop takes b3, and now I think white makes the best capture possible. Queen takes b3. You know, white might not be threatening to take that pawn straight away. I think black could win the queen if white plays queen takes b7 with rook fb8. But just the thought of queen takes b7 is hanging over black's head. Black can't ignore it forever. There will be some positions where white is simply threatening to take that pawn. Moreover, the queen's on a decent square on b3, quite active. And again, white is playing the type of game where he's trying to improve his position move by move in small ways. And by doing so, build up the pressure. By contrast, a takes b3 doesn't look so great. I mean, white can argue he's got his rook into the game free of charge, but the rook is hitting a brick wall there on a6, and I don't think white's got any way to shift that pawn. Moreover, white's inherited a set of double pawns. So only disadvantages associated with a takes b3. Nevertheless, again, we reach a position where white is only very slightly better, and black continues to manoeuvre with rook fe8. Well, bishop g5, I did mention you've got to watch out for this possibility, especially with the black bishop a long way from home. And white plays this move now. Slightly embarrassing for black, because, you know, the knight is not ideal on f6. Knight h5. Rook a d1, h6, and now this time bishop h4. Small improvements, and maybe white is getting ready for d4. Again, delaying the move rather than executing it straight away earlier on in the game seems to be a more effective way to handle the position. Now I think black just simply can't think what to do. I mean, I think despite the fact the guy's 23-50, he can't see a plan in this position. Not only is d4 a threat, white's perhaps thinking about bringing this knight into the game, either via e3 or g3 up to f5 or d5. These are the two key squares. 1, 2. And Black doesn't have a corresponding plan. He tries g5, and the idea is known from a famous game of Jose Raul Capablanca, which was played against William Winter, the English player. I don't know, I seem to recall this game. And Black's positional idea is to lock this bishop up on g3 using his own pawns. You can see what Black's positional plan is, but I think that bishop can extricate itself. It's not like the game Winter Capablanca where White had double pawns. White had a pawn on f3 and a pawn on f2. There really wasn't any way you could get rid of this lousy bishop. Here I think the bishop can come back into the game, as we will see. Moreover, who's to say that the bishop on a7 is even worse than the bishop on g3? That one may really not come back into the game. So I can see what Black's trying to do, but I don't think he's going to have much success. Firstly, White retreats with bishop h2. Black plays b5, and now White just continues to manoeuvre with queen c2, queen h7, and now knight e3. Another very good move, a pawn sacrifice to try and open up the game. You know, if Black allows just the knight to come into either of those squares, I think positionally he's really got a horrible game. You know, he's struggling to find any moves at all. I mean, probably knight d5 is stronger even than knight f5 in this particular structure. So Black buys the bait. He thinks, okay, well, I might as well be a pawn up if I've got this lousy position. White played knight d5. Black now played d3, and I suppose the idea of that was to exchange some pieces off after queen takes pawn, knight e5. This didn't bother Vocaturo in the slightest. He played queen e2, and Black pressed on with g4. Note the insecure position of the knight on h5. Very clear source of concern for Black. g4 didn't solve the problems. I mean, I'm not sure what to suggest. Black's position is hanging by a thread. The knight protects f6. f6 will need guarding. White's probably just threatening to play g4 in this situation. So Black has to stop it by playing the move himself. And after knight takes e5, again, terrific problems for Black, because White's just threatening to take on g4, then when the knight moves, take on f6. So Di Paolo had to lurch on with g3. A desperate counter-attack. But of course he's attacking two white pieces. If we go back, after f takes e5, let's just convince ourselves that h takes g4 is winning for White. Well, the problem from Black's perspective is if he moves the knight back to g7, knight f6 check, knight f6 is going to win immediately. He's got to try some move like rook f8, but it really doesn't look especially convincing. I mean, White could, if he wanted to play without risk, just play rook f1. Or if you want to take a small risk, he could even allow Black to take on f2 and sack the queen. Queen f7, king g1, he takes on h5, take on c7. Well, to be honest, I think White is just winning this position. I mean, I think Black's resistance with the queen is only going to be short. Rook, bishop and knight seems to me to be easily better than the queen, and probably White will win with direct attack. So it was a case there of choosing the lesser evil, and Black tries the confusing move g3. But White is not to be confused. He plays knight d3. Black plays queen g6. I suppose with the king on g1, Black can take this piece when he wants. White forces him to take the piece. And now g4, which is more or less the winning move. I mean, I think the threats are too great. King on h1 is perfectly secure. White is threatening not only to take the knight, he's also threatening knight takes c7, which, as you can see, is very, very effective. So Black is lost. If knight g7, just knight takes pawn. That's game over. So he plays f5, but this is desperate stuff. Pawn takes knight, queen g5. The rest of this game is not as interesting because White basically mops up. Queen comes to h4, queen f3, f takes e4. Black is playing into White's hands, opening up the game. He's hoping rook g8 will threaten rook g1 check, which actually wins for Black if it's allowed to be played, but White is on the ball. Just a very nice move here. Knight e3, queen takes h5, rook e1, queen takes h3, knight g2. White has found the optimal way to consolidate. Queen g3, and now seeing no threats, white just advanced his pawn to f5, making room for the d3 knight to come to f4, and then it will be all stations to g6 or e6 with a winning attack. So black resigned. Well, black made a fist of it in that game, but he had to loosen his king side in order to do so, and white stepped in with some really good play after that and took over. For me, the most instructive part of the game was when white was manoeuvring that knight into d5. The knight came up to e3 and then into d5, or maybe into f5. That was very, very typical of this line. If you've ever watched any of my other DVDs, you'll know that I'm a great fan of trying to shunt the opponent into a variation or a line which I've studied better than he or she has. This is actually not that easy to do, because, you know, the opponent's trying to do exactly the same to you. This clash of plans is always the most interesting aspect of the game of chess, from my perspective. But I think this variation goes a long way towards achieving this aim, you know, because black is actually quite restricted as to how they can play these positions. Once they've committed the bishop to c5, then, you know, black is actually quite limited. It's funny, in the Rye-Lopez, black's bishop often finds itself on e7. There, black seems to have a much wider choice of plans than he actually does in this position. White, meanwhile, has the normal idea of rook e1 h3, manoeuvring that knight across, and he always seems to get this slight edge. Now, the next game comes from the Abu Dhabi Open. It was played in August 2010 between Vianney Antonio, who's only graded 2208, but that's not too bad, and he's playing Wala Sarwat, whose grade is 2379. So black is quite a bit stronger than white if we're using numbers, but you wouldn't believe that as the game progresses. As we quickly see that white is setting up the typical position with bishop b3, Sarwat goes active with bishop g4. It's arguable whether that is a good move or not. And now white starts to bring his knight across. Black plays pawn up to h6. Well, white could just continue with rook e1 here, if he wanted to, followed by bringing the knight to f1. But Antonio tries something a little bit different here. g4. Very sharp and very provocative, because I know a lot of players here who would simply take that pawn without giving it a second thought. So clearly white has calculated this position, and obviously he has decided it's not dangerous. Well, let's just see how white should defend this. Firstly, king g2. Black normally follows up with a move like queen f6. But the question is, where does black go from here? What is black actually threatening in this position? For instance, could white play rook g1 and just recuperate with a move like king f1? Very long-winded it seems, but I don't think black can do very much about this idea. I think the sacrifice on g4 is unsound, and probably after some thought, that's exactly what Sarwat did too, because he retreated with bishop g6. And now white went on with his idea. He wants to put his knight on f5. Such play is known from the Philidor, funnily enough, in reverse. There's an old line invented by George Marco where black does this sort of thing to white. He plays g5 there and he gets a knight into f4 and tries to start an attack against white's king. This is kind of an old-fashioned, it looks like a very old-fashioned Steinitzian way of interpreting this variation for white. But it's dangerous. I mean, white can get this kind of slow-motion attack against black's king, anchored by the knight on f5, and it's not that easy for black to actually prevent white from crashing through. Well, Sarwat takes on f5, and now I suppose if white wanted to, he could take back with the queen, but he prefers to play g takes f5. And now you see, I think what white's hoping to do is to park his king in the corner and just go rook g1, and then really start to build up the pressure on the g file. That seems to me to be a very good plan from white's perspective. And note, the pawn on f5 is actually keeping the knight on c6 out of the game. Black would have liked to have rushed this knight across if he could to guard his king, but the pawn on f5 prevents him from doing that. So this is actually quite a difficult position for black, and he's under fire. d4. rook d1. Just pausing for the time being to give his queen a bit of scope, I think. The knight will come round by f1 and the d pawn is nicely protected. Well, black goes queen h4. White goes king g2. Black plays rook a d8, hoping to get some counterplay in the centre. And now white plays queen g3. Well, there are different ways to play this position. I must admit, if I was white, going back to d4, I would certainly be attracted by a move like king h1 here. That seems to me to be actually quite thematic. And, well, just play rook g1. I presume black just parks his king in the corner against a plan like that. We go rook g1. I don't know, this strikes me as being quite unclear. All the same, I do prefer white, but not 100% clear. However, he didn't do that. As we know in the game, he chose this plan, just manoeuvring plan really, and then offering the exchange of queens. White is saying, well, I've got the bishop pair. You know, I've got my traditional trump of the light square bishop unopposed. What are you going to do about it? Well, black also continues to manoeuvre, but white's got this edge, this dratted edge, and black can't shake it off. Knight g4. Another dream square for the knight. Now the black queen is starting to feel very restricted on h5. King h8, out of harm's way. White was threatening knight takes h6 check, of course. Queen to f3. Bishop takes c6 looks like a good move to me, and then queen f3. I think the training fire on the e5 pawn is a jolly good thing to do. I'm not sure how black relieves this pressure. For instance, after knight d7, stuff like that, white can just take this pawn with a discovered attack against the queen on h5. That wins a pawn. But in the game, queen f3 was played. Black took on c3, took on d5. White recaptured, and white probably saw this position in advance and thought to himself, well, of course I'm much better here. Black's got this big juicy weakness on e5. I'm threatening the move f6 myself. I could be threatening knight takes e5. If he plays f6, his bishop starts to get a lot worse, and after f6, well, I think I can probably play knight takes e5 anyway. I can just sense the internal dialogue because of the unprotected queen that white was having with himself in this position. So I think black's task is very difficult from here on in. I mean, I think black lacks serious counterplay, whereas for white it's much easier. He can just train his sights on the ragged nature of black's position, offer the exchange of queens, which can scarcely be refused, and then really it's just a question of consolidation. Black gets a little bit of play here. He brings his knight to d6. He's now on the pawn at f5. He's maybe threatening the pawn at c4 twice. White solves his problems elegantly by playing knight c6. B takes c4. Knight takes rook on d8. Rook takes knight. Rook ac1. And after this, white confidently steers the game to victory in a long technical encounter. Let's just see what happened, because it is interesting. Black tries to block things with c3 and gather up some loose pawns. White just stops him with bishop takes d6, and then the very nice move king e4. Pawn at c3 is very vulnerable now. White's just threatening d4 and then rook d3 to round it up. So c6 by black, what else? But this helps white, of course. d4 is now a passed pawn. It's amazing. As soon as a passed pawn is created, the task of the defence becomes much, much harder, and in this case, impossible. Black tries to delay the inevitable. I mean, he's just making moves. He's not got any plan to speak of. He's just trying to survive and hope that something turns up. No such luck, as all the pieces are exchanged, and we come now to a very easy endgame for white, where he's the exchange up for nothing. I suppose black was playing on because of white's ragged pawns, but the basic plan for white, once he's tied it up on the king side, is just to bring his king over to b7, his rook to a8, and then play rook takes a7 at the right moment, creating a passed pawn, a fatal passed pawn for black. But of course, there is a little bit of gardening to do on the king side, because black might be able to, you know, drum something up there. So h4 is a good move, as it keeps the black king out of play. Now that the white king starts his odyssey, a6 is all part of white's plan. f3 tidying up. King d3, bishop f2. Rook a8. That is the precise problem for black. Can't get his king in. If he takes on h4, we take on a7. Easy win. Black's desperate to break free, but of course he allows white to exchange off more pawns. By so doing, white emphasises the tidying nature of his ideas. Rook b8, rook takes b6 is a threat. Black has to move on. King f5 coming in for the kill. Rook h8, forcing matters. Rook h7 check. It had to happen. Black couldn't stop it. Bishop f2, rook h7, king d5, and resigns on the spot because a7 wins immediately. Well, white can choose between taking stuff or pushing stuff, as we say in the game, and that was it. A fine victory there for the lower rated player, outranked by 170 points, yet seemed to be pressing the whole way through. We just dropped back. An interesting moment occurred when white played g4. The fact that white can play this move successfully suggests that plans with bishop g4 just don't really cut the mustard against the modern Italian. My next game is not the best thing since sliced bread, but it does present a typical idea coming out of this opening. It's a game from the New Delhi Open, played in January 2010 between Grandmaster Dibyendu Barua and an Indian player called P.K. Jain, who would probably want to remain anonymous if he knew this game was being committed to a DVD. The opening moves should be very familiar by now. You should be getting used to the main ideas and thoroughfares of this opening. Black just decided to castle. Bishop dropped back to b3. And now black again played this pseudo-active move, bishop g4. And after h3, he just continued with very straightforward play. Bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and perhaps too straightforward, h6. I've mentioned time and again that, you know, this move, bishop g5, can come with great effect. And certainly here, white is threatening bishop g5. But that just emphasises the poverty of what black has actually done in this game. He plays like a club player might do, this guy Jain. I mean, he's playing a grandmaster. Confidence is a big thing in chess. He probably feels, I'm not really going to get much of a result against this guy. I'll try my best. I'll try to play as normally as possible and hope something turns up. But he's got no plan. White's plan, very easy to understand now. He's got two bishops. Slow unfolding of the game, a slow opening up of the game for the two bishops. In particular, the light square bishop would be very nice. And white has no weaknesses. That's another nice thing about this opening. You know, you're not gambiting anything. You're not creating weaknesses in your own camp. It's not a particularly difficult sort of position to understand. The game just continues in its own quiet way, and you're just building up nicely. And this type of play suits Barua down to the ground. I've known Barua for, well, let's see, when he was a kid. I mean, he used to come to England and play in the British Championship back in the 1980s, so it must be 30 years I've known him. And he's always been a brilliant natural player. Barua got to the status of grandmaster, you know, by hardly knowing any theory. He'd just turn up and play natural moves, and because he was such a great chess player, he was able to cope in virtually any situation. So this type of opening suits him perfectly. You know, the opponent has limited counterplay. He's got a clear plan. He can just use his skill to outmaneuver the opponent. And here, he's outmaneuvered this guy Jain already. He's got two bishops. That knight is definitely en route to f5. There will be some sacrifice coming up on g7 or h6. And black really has no play at all. This is a most depressing position for black. And this is only on the 12th move. So what happens in this game is that Jain just folds, really. He doesn't understand what to do. He doesn't really see anything in this position. He just makes a move. He thinks, oh my god, this knight coming to f5 is going to kill me. So I think queen e8 is just some sort of effort to perhaps get his c6 knight into the defence up to e6. But of course he's run straight slap bang into a big tactic. Bishop takes h6. Now I did say this game was poor, but you know, I could just see my own opponents in club chess, really strong opponents. Let's not make any mistake about it, falling for this trick. Because black's position is so depressing beforehand. He's been outmanoeuvred in 12 moves, from a very quiet position, that, yeah, you could easily fall for this. And now, of course, it's actually child's play for Barua to demolish the black king. Queen comes in, knight comes in comes the knight. Oh dear. The knight continues its odyssey to d5. And now, another superb move. Knight b6. I do like white's manoeuvres in this game with his knight. They are really quite aesthetic. And the knight completes the job. I've never seen a knight tour like that. It's quite unique, Don't forget, this knight started on b1 originally. Then it manoeuvred itself all the way across the board and it ends up on a8, and you begin to wonder, how the heck did it get there? Well, of course, this is completely hopeless now. You forget it. He just took twice. That was the game over. And Jane resigned because, well, king takes queen, knight takes c7. And I think Barua can probably win a rook up. So a brief game, but one which was worth seeing for not only aesthetic effect, but for the realisation that plans with bishop g4 are really quite poverty stricken in this opening. Well, we couldn't expect all the games to be quite as ridiculous as the last one. So from the ludicrous to the sublime now, you're going to be treated to a really tough all-grandmaster clash from the Manila Interzonal from 1990 between Eugenio Torre from the Philippines and Gata Kamsky from the USA. And it's a really good example of top class play in this line. So another very good game to cap time and again. So to our opening, where white plays the prescribed move order and d3 thereafter. Black castles, white castles. Black plays d6, bishop to b3, a6, knight bd2, bishop a7, and now this time Torre decides to play knight c4. The knight is on quite an influential square. Black is being provoked into playing b5, although I'm not sure that is a move Black really wants to play in this situation. It looks rather loosening. The knight reaches its ideal square on e3, where it monitors a whole range of important squares. And again, you begin to wonder in this position about the future of Black's queenside pieces. This is one of the main problems he has to solve in this opening. What does he do with the bishop, and what does he do with that rook? For White's game plan flows more easily. It's my impression that this is the case. Of course, one advantage of White's move order is that perhaps leaving the rook at home could be useful for White. A little later along the line, of course, this move's going to take some preparation. Maybe White can get f4 in. That will take some doing. He's got to play moves like h3, king h1, knight h2 first. But you never know. And f4 could come with impetus. However, it doesn't occur in this game because after h6, White now decides to revert to the normal idea with rook e1. And Kamsky puts his bishop out on e6. So Black's plans in this position involve liquidating at the right moment, either taking on c4, taking on b3, and maybe, it would be nice if Black could play d5. However, another point of the knight on c4, of course, is more or less prevents Black from playing that move for some time to come. Well, Torre was outranked in this game by 150 points, so he just decides to play bishop e3. That's a safe enough move. It completes the development of the minor pieces. It's a little unambitious, but White is claiming that he's got a very small edge in this position, and that suits him. Now, if you were feeling a bit more frisky, let's say, maybe knight e3 could have been considered by White. Yes, it does allow Black to exchange on b3, but we know that from our previous encounter with this type of position that queen takes b3 puts the question to the pawn at b7. So that might be a little nibble for White. Bishop e3, well, Black was happy to take that. Now he plays queen d7, and White sees the chance to aim for the f5 square. You get the impression in this game that Torre is trying to play with a draw in hand. He wouldn't be too unhappy if the game is drawn, but, well, White's got a little something here, and that's highlighted in the line where Black goes d5. Black played d5 in this position, then I think queen f3 would be a good move. And this sets up ideas of the knight coming into f5. Yeah, this looks like a good position for White. So, going back to the game, Kamsky decides to simplify matters with bishop takes b3 and then he plays b6. So it looks as though actually this game is heading for a draw. But, in every position in chess there are opportunities to play for the win. And so the game continues. Black plays king h7, perhaps with the idea of getting rid of that knight. g6 would be a good counter. Rook a d1. White says, well, you can play g6 if you want to, and Kamsky declines the opportunity. He plays, if you can call it an opportunity, he plays rook fe8. Now, a lot of players would have been tempted to play g6 in this situation and just nudge the knight back, and perhaps then rook fe8, but then I think rook f1. And my comment earlier about the rook being on f1 supporting f4 finally comes to pass. Again, I think black is regretting this move g6, because as you can see, he's loosened the knight on f6. So f4 could come, and white can claim something in this position, for sure. I don't know how great the advantage is, but it is something, because white's king position is more secure. So black refrains from g6 for the time being. Of course, when we're talking about games at this level, you have to understand that even very small imprecisions can cost the game. So this is why Kamsky's very reluctant to play moves like g6. He can't take that move back. He will be nursing a slightly airy king. And, you know, against a really strong player, this is not ideal. In general, people like Kamsky and Storey like to keep their options open as much as possible when they're playing amongst each other, because they know that any small mistake is going to be pounced upon. So white continues with this draw in hand stuff with knight d5. Black plays rook a d8. And after d4, we reach a position which can best be described as not quite equal. Now, I don't want you to underestimate the significance of that remark, because sometimes when you're playing players of your own strength, you do have to be satisfied with small things and try to work with small things and try to grow these advantages throughout the game. There's no doubt white has a small edge. I'm not sure how big it is, but it is something. Why does he have a small edge? Number one, the white king position is slightly more secure than black's king. Secondly, the pawns in the centre restrict black, and they give white manoeuvring opportunities with his rooks. So, for instance, the white rooks could easily start thinking about swinging along to third rank now that white's played d4. I mean, we don't know yet which rook white will move in. Maybe the d rook, maybe the e rook, but certainly that's a possibility. So black has got to look after his king here, and he's got to look after it pretty carefully. So Kamsky starts with king g8, and the point of that move is to prepare a further exchange with knight e7. I think if black could get that knight on f5 off the board, he would consider that a serious victory, really. But of course he couldn't do it right away because f7 was attacked. So he had to prepare that move with king g8. So Storey is alert to that possibility and moves his knight away. That knight is kept for future action. Black plays b5 and white plays h3. You see this move virtually in every game on this DVD. It has to be said, it's almost like a move which is automatic in this system. Knight e7 and the queen retreats, and black gradually improves the position of his queen by bringing it to c5. But the thing about black's queen is it's operating in isolation. However, Kamsky has provoked the move d5 for a reason. He's taken a lot of the elasticity out of white's centre, and he's now, with rook f8, preparing to go f5, which will be a move furnishing counterplay. Queen c2, trying to put the brakes on f5. Rook b8, it looks though Kamsky's getting into the game here. b4 shutting down the b file, and now rook a1. So white is, by clever play, maintaining his edge. Again, I should stress, margins, the higher you go up in a game, are smaller and smaller. So rook a1, yeah, what's the point of that? Well, if black goes c6 to try and break the shackles, then I think white was intending a takes b5. And if a takes b5, we take on c6. He takes with the queen, or the white knight comes into d5. Then rook a7 hitting the knight, followed by rook a1. As you can see, white is keeping a measure of control over the position. He's definitely better. It's just a question of how much better. Something to work with anyway. That's the important thing. In fact, that could be a mantra for the whole variation, really. Something to work with. That's what you need. Going back to the game then, after rook a1, black played rook a8. Typical tough Kamsky move that. It looks like a nothing move. It looks like the type of move which a club player would turn his nose up at, because it's just so passive. But Kamsky, you know, he's such a tough guy. You know, he's unbelievable toughness as a player. He has no qualms about playing that type of move. If it has to be done, it has to be done, and that's that. Storey presses on with c4. Black takes, white recaptures, and now Kamsky makes his bid for freedom with f5. The question is that a move which gives good counterplay, or is it just a weakening move? Storey thinks the latter, and trains his sights on the pawn at c7. Black defends as he must, and now b5. So white is now starting to get to grips with black's position. It's just a question of how much counterplay does black have on the king side. Kamsky took. Well, he could definitely block in this position with a5, and then I think Storey was going to play rook a3. Very flexible, and yeah, the idea of that is clearly to come to c3 and continue to bombard the pawn at c7. So for instance, if black took this pawn and then played rook f4, we go queen c2 and rook c3 comes next, which looks like a fairly optimal way to organise the major pieces. Note the knight on e3 is really good here, holding everything together. It's a normal type of position, but black has a devil of a job relieving the pressure against c7. So that would be quite nice for white. White's creeping up on black by imperceptible means in this game. So a takes b5, f takes e4, and now Storey comes in with rook a6. And I think Kamsky now really plays his only move here, queen d4. But from now on, I think white starts to play exceptionally well. Just going back, it's getting harder and harder to suggest moves. I mean, for instance, if we go queen b7, then I think rook c6 is just a really good move. Black's put his queen on the wrong square, and c7 is dropping. I don't think, obviously, you can't take that, because if you take it, you lose your queen by virtue of a discovered check. Again, queen b8, that looks like such a passive square for the queen. Maybe doubling up. And then if knight f5, trying to get rid of the knight, we chop that off. And queen c6 again. You can see black is in a real bind. Black's even a pawn up in this position. But he's got some serious problems actually finding something to do. Back at the game, this is why Kamsky goes queen d4. But as I say, Storey really does start to play good moves now. He plays queen a2, just keeping the pieces on, trying to make a target of the black queen, believe it or not. Then comes rook c4, and the idea of that is to even trap the queen there with rook a3. And now Kamsky goes wild. This is move 35. I don't know whether this move was prompted by time trouble or whether he just couldn't see what to do. He went for the spectacular move rook takes f2, which looks like a terrible blunder, but Kamsky has calculated quite a long way. Now, I think we must assume from that maybe he was getting short of time. There was an alternative here in knight f5 and just let it happen, rook a3. Then we try and sack the queen with some sort of bamboozling idea like this. Rook c3 and then knight b6 and try and hang on in this position. I think the problem with this position is that black has got too many weak pawns to nurse. So for instance, if white goes queen a7, you know, it's hard to see any counterplay for black. I mean, if he goes rook f7, we go queen b7, and black is again very, very tied up here. If he goes with the ghastly move knight a8, I mean, you may scoff, but it's hard to see moves. Then I think b6 is good, and the idea of that is just to give the queen a bit of air. If black takes with a knight, we break in with rook takes c7. If he takes with the pawn, then I think we chop on c8, which is obviously very desirable, and now queen d7. We reach a position where black has nominal compensation for the queen, but his pieces are hopelessly placed, and the white queen is just going to round up all of the black pawns, and this pawn on d5 is going to win the game. It really is not an easy position for black, and you know, this position in front of us gives me the strong impression that black is very disjointed here. His queen is operating alone, and none of the other pieces can come to assist, apart from this amazing move, rook takes f2, which looks like a total blunder. But in fact, what Kamsky had calculated was that after queen takes f2, rook f8, queen e1, black is going knight takes d5. And the white pieces are quite unstable in this situation. Moreover, if black wins back a rook, let's say white ends up a piece up, well, black could have three very dangerous pawns. and the rook on a6 could be out of the game. So this is actually quite an ingenious plan of counterplay from Kamsky. But Torre's equally on the ball, and this is what makes this game so memorable. He counters with a brilliant idea of his own, rook a3. Torre in his day, of course, was one of the finest players in the world. I mean, he was Philippine #1 for a long, long time. And, you know, he could duel with the best, and he beat the best as well, as we're going to see in this game. So Kamsky's got to take that piece. Knight takes d5. It is different, this position, to the one that went before, because, again, black is being nailed down to those pawns. He does have 3 pawns for the knight, but they're not especially good pawns. And, again, his pieces don't work together. The rook on f8 and the queen on a3 are not cooperating together. That is the problem. So, black has just got to sit here and defend. King h2, very insidious move that. Just taking control of the board. Queen takes b5, knight takes c7. Well, now it's only 2 pawns for the piece, and white is retaining his pieces for the attack. So it's hard to believe in black's position anymore. Rook a8 check, king g7. Of course, it's not going to be that easy to win this, but I think white's next move clarifies matters. I think he's threatening to pile up on this pawn at d6 and just win it. That is black's problem. He has no counterplay. So h5 was played, queen c4, with the clear idea of queen c6. It's amazing how that knight's just holding everything together. Black can't even check white in this position. Queen f5, rook takes d6. Unfortunately for Kamsky, that was probably inevitable. Knight c7, a check before dying. Knight e6 check. h4, freezing the kingside pawns. A lovely move, knight g5 to finish. Knight f7 check, and now it's a question of whether Kamsky can spring some tricky drawing mechanism on white. There's no chance of that, because the knight is very elastic, and even a memorable piece in this position, it remains for white to mop up. Okay, king g4, king d3, king f5. Well, let's just see king g3 in this position. I think white will just carry on trundling up the board with king e4, king takes g2, king takes. Black can't do a thing. White's just going to play king g5 and then mop up. Knight e5, knight takes g6, knight f4, knight takes h5. It's gone. So going back to the game, king f5, king d4, king g4, king e4. Nigel Short pointed out a very nice checkmate here. King e5, king e4, knight e5 check. Watch this, very nice indeed. King f3, g4, king f4, zugzwang, and now this superb mate with the knight. Well, I actually missed that. In the excitement, king e4, after such a long game, he's probably just relieved to obtain a winning position. So the finish is not quite as spectacular as that, but it's equally effective. The king reaches the end of its journey, and that was that. Very good game all the way through, and a game which exemplifies really the way they play this line at Grandmaster level. Small edge, work with it, grind the other guy down. We've talked about black's freeing break in the open game, d7 to d5. And so we ought to see what happens in the main line of our favourite variation when black executes this move immediately. This may well be one of black's very best lines. Yet in the game David Howe versus David Navarra, this game was played in the European Championship playoffs in March 2010, white built up an advantage after this move. Now the traditional idea is that yes, black does get a measure of freedom for his pieces, but he has slight problems defending his pawn on e5 comfortably. He's probably got to go in for bishop g4 here, and altogether black's position is regarded as a little bit loose, although he has achieved reasonable results from this position. White's idea, well, probably just to play h3 and then knight e4, get the knight into a good square. There'll be a bit of pressure coming up against this pawn unless black does something radical against it. So in this game, Navarra decides to play knight b6, and Howe plays bishop b5, which is thematic in the sense that it adds to the pressure on e5. So great now is the pressure. Well, I think, let's see, we're not just simply threatening to take it off. Bishop takes c6 followed by rook takes e5. I think that is a threat given that the bishop on c5 is attacked. This is why Navarra retreated with bishop d6. But Howe went through with the main idea. He attacked the bishop, very happy if black surrenders this bishop. Navarra, of course, 2700 player, doesn't like that idea very much, so he retreats to h5, and now white puts his knight in on e4. Black plays knight to e7, knight takes d6, very happy to gain 2 bishops in this position. Black recaptures with the queen to try and get compensatory pressure against d3. White goes g4, and I think after this move white can count on the advantage, because I think he's going to actually win a pawn. Whether it will be enough to win the game is another matter, but white is winning a pawn in this position. In the game, black played a6. He could try bishop g6, then I think we gobble the pawn, and now it's just a question of whether black can scratch around for some compensation. He can certainly get the light square bishop off the board after c6 and chop it off, but I think white just takes back with the pawn there. I mean, this should be a pawn up really without too many tears. Certainly if the queens are coming off, you have to start believing in white's chances, although it won't be too easy to realise this advantage, but nevertheless it's a solid pawn. Going back to the position after knight takes e5, maybe a6 and then knight bd5. Again, knight takes c4 looks very ropey from black's point of view. It's just a pawn down for nothing. So black tries to confuse matters by keeping pieces on, but I think white is able to consolidate fairly comfortably here. I mean, black's got no dark square bishop, so it's very hard to see him getting in on these squares with a knight, and it's doubly hard to see him mating white on g2 here, which is probably about the focal of black's intentions at the moment. I just don't think black's got enough of the pawn. I mean, he's fishing. He played a6, bishop a4, knight takes, queen takes, but it's going to come to it eventually. He's going to have to play bishop g6, and now white comes in and nabs the pawn. So the best that Navarra has got now is just to try and make a draw, to exchange off as many pieces as possible, and just to make a draw with the opposite colour bishops. It's not going to be an easy task, but I think it's doable. Now, if we just go back to knight takes e5, I would have been very tempted as white to take with the rook. But I think there black was probably planning f6 and then rook a e8. This bears some similarity with the Marshall Gambit of the Ruy Lopez, this sort of position, where black has sacked a pawn, but he's got tremendous freedom here. And now it's white that has the problems developing his queen side. Moreover, black's threatening moves like, let's say, queen d5 to f3. That would be a pretty unpleasant invasion for white to contemplate. So all in all, Howe decided to take with the pawn here, and he's got more cover for his king in this variation. Yes, the rook comes to the middle, but rook e3 is good. Queen comes back to b3, offering the exchange of queens. Rook d1. You can't help but feel that, you know, white should have some way to nurse this advantage into something greater. Well, Navarra didn't get 2700 by giving up, and he consistently tries to emphasise the positive aspects of his position. Well, the only one that I can see is a very, very strong light square bishop. Rook takes d5, queen takes d5. Black must keep play focused on the light squares here. Queen d2 protecting the bishop. h6 to give his king a bit of luft. And now Howe comes in with rook d8. Again, it's playing with the draw in hand, that move, I would say. Right, well, bishop d5 is now definitely on the cards. So white has to retreat with queen d4. Queen c2, good counterplay. When you've got opposite colour bishops in the middle game, counterplay is the order of the day. And I think this mechanism with queen c2 and then queen e4 actually saves the day for white here, because bishop d5 is a dangerous threat, and white must attend to it, after which black comes down. And so a natural balance was reached. Draw agreed. I think we can conclude that d5 is not a bad move at all, and white should meet it by chopping off and then focusing his sights on the e5 pawn. In general, white's results from this position have been slightly favourable, but black has his fair share of counterplay in this line. However, as we've seen, in the game Howe versus Navarra, after bishop b5, white kept an edge. Occasionally, we're going to have to face other moves, apart from bishop c5. And one of these moves is the Hungarian defence with bishop e7. I mean, this is actually quite rare, but it's definitely a move which compels us to change our approach slightly. Now, we could play d3 if we wanted to, but I think the more effective way is to actually play d4 in this position. And devotees of the Hungarian defence are usually very solid types. They just want to sit there with a passive position. They don't mind defending for a while. They're just trying to outlast you. Well, yes, that's true, but white definitely gets a small edge here against this system, if not more. And I'll show you how Grandmaster works with this edge and increases it. We're sitting alongside Vladimir Baclan. It's the Andorra Open in 2007. And he's playing John Molinero, who I presume is an Andorran or a Spanish player. However, you look at it, this game is going to be an object lesson in how to outplay a weaker opponent than yourself, because white doesn't give black any chance throughout the game and just seems to win completely effortlessly. Now, in this position, white plays an unfashionable looking move here, d takes e5, and that's thought not to be especially good, because with the queens coming off, black has an easier time of it. However, or is supposed to, Baclan's got his own ideas, and he plays a very coherent move here, queen e2, followed by c3. Now, probably white's approach was prompted by a desire to steer black away from anything familiar that he'd ever faced before. It's quite an unusual way of playing from white, but also it's a very respectable way of playing. I mean, white just contents to set up a position without any weaknesses at all. He's got perhaps slightly more space, slightly easier time of it developing his pieces, and he's waiting for moves like bishop g4 because they give him a target to latch onto. And again, we see the kind of utter uselessness of this move as white gains a whole move with h3 and then gets on with the business of rerouting his knight around to the usual suspect square g3 and then probably up to f5. So Molinero decides to interrupt that plan with knight h5, and once again, you know, Baclan knows how to play these players. He just takes away their primary plan and he leaves them with nothing to do. This is an incredibly effective way of beating a weaker player. Weaker player sets up an idea, you stop it. You don't weaken your position. Problem with black's position now is, of course, he's got a loose knight on h5 to deal with. Black has the problems. King h8. Knight comes into e3. Black plays bishop to d6. And now, what could be simpler? Baclan just sticks his knight in on f5. There's nothing fancy about his approach. He knows that knight's going to be intimidating for his low-ranked opponent. And sure enough, Molinero takes the knight. e4. Probably a mistake, but I'm not sure what to suggest. I think white's probably threatening knight g5 anyway. Eventually that knight on h5 is going to tell us a tactical weakness, and knight f6 doesn't really help matters because it runs straight into the move g4, of course. And white has a pawn roll on the king side. He's got two bishops. Black's position is noticeable only for the absence of counterplay. But e4 is a mistake, knight g5, and suddenly black has two tactical problems. He's got the knight on h5 and the pawn on f7 to worry about. Knight takes g3. F takes g3. Bishop takes g3 check. King goes to f1. Queen goes to f6. King g2. Bishop h4. The sacrifice is not sufficient. And Baclan just mops up in the most effortless way possible. Pawn takes, just swap off, no sense in being fancy. Black is not allowed the ghost of a tactical chance. Bishop e3, rook a e8, really he could have resigned this position. A token check before dying, king f1, and black decided to resign. I mean, that's quite polite against a grandmaster. Two bishops, very, very powerful attack as well. Yes, black can play rook takes b2. Let's see, maybe c4 would be a good move against that. Then rook comes to d2 only move. Probably then a simple move like bishop e3, driving the rook passive. Bishop comes to c2. You can see black is coming under a withering attack with absolutely no compensation for it, no counterplay. So rather than suffer against a grandmaster, he decided to pack it in. I think what I'm saying is that actually when you face the Hungarian defence, quite a good way is just to do as Baclan did. Take on e5, go queen e2, and then follow up with c3. And continue with your plan. h3, knight bd2, knight f1, knight g3, etc. Usual play on f5. And if black decides to get frisky, well, we know the consequences. White gets h3 for free. Another one of those passive moves that could easily be seen at club level is 3d6. It doesn't crop up very much at master level, but on the odd occasion it surfaces, and it's as well to have something against it. Well, there's nothing really to stop white from proceeding in the normal way with c3, except that I'm very tempted to play d4 if I can. I mean, there's nothing wrong in taking the centre if black is obliging to play so passively. The thing is, c3 also prepares the interesting move queen b3, because one of the drawbacks of d6 is, of course, that black is lagging in development. Bishop c5 develops a piece, as does knight f6. Bishop e7 even gets a piece of timber off the back rank. But d6 does nothing for black's development. So I'm looking at all these options like d4, I'm looking at castles, I'm looking at queen b3, and I don't see any compensation for black at all. I think actually this move c3 is a pretty effective way of combating d6. d4 has been played, there's nothing wrong with that move, but I think actually that's a little bit too obliging. You know, black can play stuff like this. He can take on d4 and go g6. We don't necessarily want to go into these waters if we can help it. So I think c3 is a pretty good move, and to illustrate the potential of this move, I've chosen a game from the World Under-20 Championship, which was played in Yerevan in 2007, between Ildar Khairulin, whose grade is 2567, so already a pretty strong Grandmaster player, and Vyacheslav Kulakov, whose grade is about 2260, I think. But in this game, he just gets pulverised because, well, he overlooks white's primary threat to start off with, which is queen b3. And he may have thought, okay, I can get away with this, I can try knight a5 in this position. But unfortunately, then I think white just wins a pawn. Bishop takes f7 check. King f8 and now queen a4. I just don't think black can claim compensation for the pawn here. He's got a shaky king and he seems to be a pawn down for nothing. So that is no good. Hence, how is black going to defend f7? Well, in the game, Kulakov played probably the only move here, knight h6. And now, of course, d4 sets up the nasty threat of bishop takes h6. That knight on h6 is looking like a bit of a target. And in fact, after castles, white lopped it off. Now, the rest of this game is actually played quite steadily by white, because white's just happy to have inflicted that weakness on the black king, and now he's just going to play against it. Very simple. D takes e5, knight takes e5, white castled, knight g6. I mean, black's got a bit of a problem here because he can't resolve the problem of his king. Meanwhile, white just plods on, continues to make very solid moves. Knight e5 was answered by bishop e2, c5 by knight f3, offers the chance to exchange pieces. This is up white street. D takes e5, knight f3. Every exchange, means that the black king position A becomes weaker, and the poor pawn structure that black has inherited after bishop takes f6 becomes more of a defining feature of the position. E takes f5, bishop takes f5, bishop d3. The great players always keep it simple when they've got a very good game. They don't try and complicate matters. They just very happy to take everything off, and it's effortless. He won a pawn. And nothing black could do from this point could save him. He tried to get his rook as active as possible. White put his knight on a completely invulnerable square, then he protected it by playing a4. Black tries to get his king to safety, no dice. Eventually, white has to bring his rook into the game, and he does so with effortless ease, nudging the bishop back so he can gain time with his rook, and then rook b7. Clinical, effective, and very masterly indeed. So let me see. d6, I don't rate it. We go back to the opening. I think it's just a passive move. And whilst you can go d4, that will involve you in more book knowledge, let us say, than my simple solution, which is just to play c3. Maintaining ideas of d4, you could go with d3. Queen b3 is certainly a threat, as we saw in the game. Black doesn't have an easy time of it against this accurate move. To conclude, I want to take a look at a very rare bird indeed. That is to say, the voluntary retreat on the fourth move with bishop b6. This introduces the so-called closed variation, which was a favourite of Alexander Alekhine on occasion. It's not bad, but it does give white the opportunity to take the centre, and he should take that opportunity definitely by playing d4. Then I suppose opening up the game would tend to favour white if black were ever to capture on d4, because then white would have two unchallengeable centre pawns. I mean, if we just contrast this with the main line where white goes d4 straight away, well, of course, there black flicks in the check. This is the move which enables all of black's counterplay. So, for instance, after bishop takes d2 and then d5, this is the main line, and the position's clarifying. Well, you know, theory shows that black has an easier time of it in this variation than it does in our favoured modern Italian position. But it's all different after bishop b6. This time I think d4 is definitely the way. Be energetic against slow moves. I mean, I think that must be the way to go. Then black keeps the position closed and white castles, daring black once again to capture in the centre, which would be exceptionally foolhardy, of course. Then we get a typical position after knight f6, rook e1, d6, whereupon h3 is now a good move. I think in a situation like this, where you've played d4 early, you definitely don't want black to play bishop g4 now. So h3 is a necessary evil. But on the other hand, it's quite a useful move. So we reach a typical position from this line, where white maintains a slight edge. Very rare occasion that you have to face this line. I think this is the way to go with white. And we're going to see a game from the Crayon Open to finish off with, which was played in 2004 between Grandmaster Vladislav Nevednici and a French player called Luc Renazé, who basically knows how to defend this position for a little while. I mean, he just makes careful moves to start off with. But the problem is that black lacks long-term prospects here. Once again, the capture on e4 looks totally suicidal. Let's see, opening up the e-file here, I suppose white just takes this pawn on e5, and now there are a lot of threats already. When you've got the queen there on the e-file, on the same file as the king, you know, to open up that file was just foolish. So Renazé keeps the position closed and castles instead, hoping at some point to put pressure on that pawn. Well, you know, the Grandmaster knows how to play against a lesser opponent. He just maintains the tension. He sets up a difficult position where the opponent has a chance to go wrong. Give the other guy a chance to think, and then, you know, inevitably the mistake will come. Set up some pressure, and the pressure's on black because white has more space. It's got better control of the centre. This must mean something in chess. This is the whole idea of the opening, you know, to reach a playable middle game, usually by domination of the centre. And this is exactly what white is doing here, exerting a bit of pressure. So much pressure that black feels obliged to retreat the queen. It's not a bad move. Safety first. You know, black is moving the queen off the same file as the white rook. And he's also thinking about maybe d5. So whatever white does, he's got to watch out for that breakout attempt. This prompts Nevednici's next move, queen b3. We've talked a little bit about, you know, taking the enemy's plan away is a good thing in chess. And this is what Nevednici does. Or he thinks he does, because black gets in on the act perhaps slightly too early here with d5. Now, common sense should have told him this was very risky. And the reason it's risky is he's got one less piece developed than white. And this means that it's much easier for white to develop his queen's rook than it is black. Now, these two small things might not matter too much, but with the position opening up, they matter more. So, I don't know. I think if black was going to open things up, perhaps he should have done it via c takes d4 first, and then bishop a5. This looks like a slightly better way to open it up. But even there, I mean, I think after d5, white is better. I don't think there's much doubt about that. For instance, tactics can fall white's way here in the position after knight b4, bishop c4. If black takes that pawn, once again he runs into a classic double attack there, and that knight on b4 is very precarious. So if we go back to d5, I suppose knight e5 is a better move. Then we chop that off, we get out of the pin, and once again there's no doubt about white's superiority here. It's just a question of how much. All these thoughts prompt Renazé to go active, but instinct, the Grandmaster's instinct, is probably telling him at this point there's something fishy about that move. He's gone active perhaps one or two moves too early. But if you go back, you know, it's not that easy for black to get those pieces out. I mean, the queenside pieces are a real bugbear in the open game. If you solve that problem, usually you've got a good game. Two problems for black in the open game: to get d5 in, to get the queenside pieces out. If you solve those problems, you're really usually okay. So anyway, d5 was played. Now what should Nevednici do? He takes on e5. There are a couple of captures, then he takes on e4. He's hoping to liquidate. Bishop c4. Now alarm bells are starting to ring in the black camp. This is where he feels the lack of the light square bishop in the game. He feels keenly the weakness of f7 in this position. Rook takes e5. Bishop takes f7 check. Knight c4. A very unfortunate turn of events for Inarze. He opened up the game too early and now he's suffering the consequences. He plays the only move to carry on, which is rook e7. But once again, you know, the great players, they make it look easy. Never Nietzsche turns this into a technical exercise. He just takes on b6. He retreats the bishop. His job now is to win cleanly. Without tactics, that's that. And so he's very happy to swap. Anchor his bishop in the middle of the board. Double up on the pawn. Take away all the tactics. Solid pawn up. At some stage, all other things being equal, white's going to create a passed pawn on the queen side. That is to say, if black can last the pace. Usually what happens in this type of scenario is the defender, or if you like the guy material down, tries to force the pace and it just ends up weakening his position even more. So white continues to unhurriedly manoeuvre and takes opportunities to exchange pieces. There's a bit of pressure on g7. Black relieves it for a little while, but I don't think he can ultimately relieve it with the queen piling in there. Queen f5 check was a threat. Black stopped it. Rook e3. There's no chink of light showing in white's position. That is black's problem. f3. Little chink there on f2 and g3, but how is black going to get to that? Knight d5. He thinks he can get to it. Queen takes e4 check. He cannot get to it, and that is the end of the game. Well, I mean, you can play on if you like, but Inarze is a gentleman and decided to resign this position, going 2 pawns down for nothing, and the pieces are all coming off. So, just to summarise then, on the rare occasion that you have to face this closed variation, just stick with normal moves. I mean, just be content that you've got the centre and a slight advantage in space. Don't forget this important little move h3. You should maintain your nagging edge throughout the opening and early middle game. After that, it's up to you. Well, summarising, I think the modern Italian game is a pretty good weapon to use at any level of play. I mean, we've seen grandmasters using it with great success, some of the best players around, and so you can use it too. It's solid, 100% sound, durable, and will serve you well, I think, especially at club level, as black players frown when they see d3 coming on the board, and in that state of mind they might not necessarily understand that actually this is a dynamic system. It's not as quiet as it looks. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Well, that's it for now. I hope you'll join me on the companion volume about the two knights defence.